Why in the world is the United States in Somalia and attacking civilians in Somalia?
Well, because that's the habit of the United States. We're going to talk about that.
We found natural resources?
There are natural resources in Somalia. If you have been following the Black Hawk Down incident since 1993, the United States has been in Somalia, and that continues. But now media reports are that the U.S. had an airstrike in Somalia that killed at least 7 people in January, most of them kids. Most of them were young boys, 3 brothers and 4 other young boys. So we're going to tell you about that. Somalia has been suffering from infighting from al-Shabaab, which is an affiliate of al-Qaeda. That is what the United States has long since admitted. And we're going to discuss that fight in a second, but first the details. Here, according to airwars.com, this is a watchdog group that watches airstrikes that hit civilians and non-civilians. And the reports are that this took place in January 30th. Local news reported 7 victims between the ages, the youngest was 8, and the oldest was 20. 3 of them were brothers. Here is, according to the Somali news agency Caasimada. Now, I had to use a Google Translate for this because I don't speak this language, so you will just sort of excuse the translation if it's crude. It says, these young civilians who were killed were detained in a place where al-Shabaab members are being prosecuted. So the 3 brothers were being accused of being a part of al-Shabaab, but had not actually been. It was not definitive that they were. That's where the bombing was targeted. Some of the local people they contacted confirmed that 3 of the youths were initially arrested by al-Shabaab because of the chaos in the area, while the other 4 were just taking them for lunch. And that's how they encountered the bombing. Either they were taking them to lunch or they were taking them their lunch. Again, the translation is not clear on that. The U.S. has admitted that it is fighting al-Shabaab, but the deputy of this district where the strike was reported said this. Speaking to the media, the deputy Mahas district commissioner confirmed that the deaths of the 7 villagers as a result of the strike believed to have been carried out by the U.S. military. He carried on the military, both the Somali and the U.S., or he called on them to consult with local administration before conducting any airstrike to save the lives of the people in al-Shabaab-held areas. The U.S. often carries out airstrikes in parts of Somalia when the army of the country carries out operations against the areas where al-Shabaab organization is located. Now, I want to flash back to late 2021 for a minute here, because you may recall that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the U.S. would be more transparent from now on when air raids and strikes hit civilians. Remember this? This was in 2021 after the New York Times exposed an air raid on Syria in 2019 that was hidden from the public, because you may recall that an internal assessment from the Pentagon lawyers said that this could be classified as a war crime, this strike on Syria, where over 60 people were killed. Most of them were women and children, but the Pentagon at the time had said, well, 12 of them were ISIS. So we did get the bad guys, the other 48 collateral damage. Just so
you know, they generally take males that are age 11 and higher and just can count them as military targets because they're of military age, when they may have not been military at all. That is a tactic that they use.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and by the way, we should also point out ISIS, who we fund. So, I see. There are 11 ISIS members that we're funding.
Right.
Okay, just to be clear.
Yeah.
And Al-Qaeda as well?
Now, kind of look at some of the language. I want to skim through this document that Lloyd Austin said at the time when he said that the Pentagon would do better. Let's just look at some of the quotes. Like, we're committed to adjusting our policies and holding our senior leaders responsible. We'll work hard to avoid causing harm to civilians. We can work harder. We take this seriously. We're committed to protecting them. We have more work to do. Committed to doing better, right? I mean, this reads like a performance review at an office job, not we really should not be killing civilians. It's like, we're going to try not to, basically. Is how that, isn't that what you get from that?
We're going to give it the old heave ho.
Yeah, that killing civilians, we're going to try not to do that.
When you have someone like Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, who literally tells us that the killing of innocent civilians and children specifically is okay, And according to her, that she's fine with that. And, that's just part of it's collateral damage. That's fine. She can live with that.
Well, this is what she said about Iraq, right? That when, there are civilian deaths, she said it's worth it.
It's worth
That's
it.
specifically what she said.
So just transpose that to any conflict that we're currently in, Iraq or whatever. You want to call Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Well, we have not seen transparency about a possible strike that killed young boys. Not yet, anyway. And we are almost 3 months since this reported attack. So we'd like to see maybe a little bit more transparency, given that you told us you would, Lloyd Austin. And, could this have been stopped? Could this have been, this do better? Is this just, 7 boys, so we are doing better. We didn't kill 60, but we have now 7. I don't know. But, maybe that wouldn't have helped because maybe it wasn't military. This is according to antiwar.com, saying it's possible that the CIA was conducting those drone strikes and it wasn't the military at all. Okay, well, why are we striking there at all? We knew this, in fact, because the defense budget of 2023 told us, now this is a teeny tiny little bit of the defense budget. I know that it's a terrible screenshot and that I'll get lectured later from Clayton. But section 1210 of the defense budget told us that we would be, equipping the military forces of Syria. And in fact, it earmarked over $1 million just for a report on how to do that. So the first part says that the Department of Defense and the Secretary of Defense would provide an assessment, and his budget to do that would be $1 million. But that's not the entire budget. There's even more. And this brings us to the question of why. Why is the U.S. there, and what are they trying to accomplish? Well, al-Shabaab has been the target of the U.S. for decades. And in fact, it was the group responsible for the Black Hawk Down mission of 1993. Now, here is a fairly concise explanation, just to, sort of put a crude why on it, from Task and Purpose. This is a military publication. It's written for the military, as journalist Ann Garrison for the Gray Zone reports, but it's actually an unusually frank analysis of the role that the U.S. has played in Somalia. Here is their summary that in the aftermath of the Black Hawk Down mission, Somalia fell into deeper chaos with attempts at creating a central transitional government failing to enact lasting stability. The country was dominated by disparate warlords, some with American and CIA support. At that time, local regions' religious force emerged trying to instill its own form of order, the Islamic Courts Union, which was formed in 2000 and made up of religious courts that offered some form of authority. The ICU aimed at stopping the warlord violence and establish a rule of law, albeit one of Sharia law. In June of 2006, the ICU managed to oust the CIA-backed warlords and take control of Mogadishu, putting it under authority for the first time in 15 years. But that rule was short-lived because 6 months later, Ethiopia led an invasion of Somalia with American support, nominally to support the transition federal government. The offensive was supported by the African Union's mission to Somalia, as well as the United States and other Western nations. So this is a military publication admitting how much the U.S. has been interfering with Somalia and for how long. In fact, the powers to do this came from the 9/11 era powers from President Bush, and they were expanded under President Obama. It was Obama, in fact, who started to use drones to strike. President Trump paved the way for more airstrikes, but then he actually withdrew troops from Somalia. President Biden took office and put them right back there. Many say the U.S. has interest in Somalia because of oil, natural resources, and geopolitics. Again, they are always trying to prevent a united Arab, any kind of united Arab states. Meaning that they want to destabilize Somalia. But they're not alone. The UK, NATO, the European Union, and the UAE all have their own agendas in Somalia as well. And is there an end in sight? No, not according to Task and Force. They say that in January, the U.S. contributed $9 million in new weapons to the Somali national government. The Danab battalion numbered approximately 1,500 in November 2022, but there are ongoing efforts to grow it. Most recently, an American airstrike killed 7 al-Shabaab fighters, so they are at least confirming this, but this is a different date. saying that this happened on February 21st. So they're not confirming that it's the same 7. They're talking about maybe a different strike. So they are saying, and they're not saying that this was civilians. So given increased American involvement and no signs of any settlement, the United States fight against al-Shabaab is likely to continue.
Of course. Well, thank you for that. Good news on, and the United States will continue to attack civilians. And I don't believe we're going to see any sort of like large reporting on this at all. Like they'll kind of pick and choose and cherry pick. And it seems to me,
if it were Ukrainian civilians, we would care a heck of a lot more. But, 7 Middle Eastern boys, it's up to us to care. Most people don't.
Let us know in the comments who even knew we were in Somalia in the first place. Who even knew about this attack?
If not for that Jeremy Renner movie.
Yeah.
Was it Jeremy Renner?
Exactly.
Black Hawk Down?
Black Hawk Down was
no, that was
Jeremy
Jake
Renner's time.
Gyllenhaal.
Jake Gyllenhaal?
Was it Jake?
Yeah.
It was years ago. That movie was 90s, wasn't it?
Black Hawk Down? Yeah, that
Are
was
you
Jake.
sure? Somebody IMDb that. We're probably all wrong.
Yeah, I think it's way before Jake Gyllenhaal's time. 90s.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great Mark Bowden book. If you've never read it, read that book. It's a great book.
Josh Hartnett.
And Ewan McGregor. Okay.
Yeah.
And Eric Bana.
We were all wrong.
The only reason we learn about
Sizemore,
these
Tom
attacks
Hardy.
is because, Tom Sizemore. The only reason we learn about these attacks is because of journalists, largely.
Yes.
The only reason we hear about them. And then we get the Pentagon to admit to them. Just like we had in Syria. Like we don't get these, or like we learned in Afghanistan, right? Because journalists were there and got the coverage and then they ask about it and push on it. That's the only reason we learn about it. They don't volunteer this information. Otherwise, they'd be doing it every day.
I did send an invitation to Ann Garrison, the Gray Zone reporter, to come on and explain this a little further because she had an interview with an interesting political rights advocate on the Gray Zone just as recently, I think it was January or February, talking about all kinds of U.S. involvement and how the United States has worked to delegitimize their presidential election because it was not a presidential election that happened last year. It wasn't that civilians got to vote at all. It was some kind of proxy. They say that Representative Ilhan Omar, who is a Somali refugee, has actually worked with them to destabilize that region. I don't know if that's true. I would love for her to come on and explain that, and hopefully she does.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.